Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit in May 2021. And we're going to cover a really very interesting topic, right, which is related to a new set of regulations that the European Union is published as a and it starts, the regulation very focused on AI and machine learning, but as conversation and on a session that we had last month, it could be so I think we're going to start with Jeff, who's going to do a kind of an overview of the situation, and then it's about a free flowing of exchange of ideas, and just introduce yourself when you're presenting, and then we'll take it from there. Over to you, Jeff.
All right, absolutely. So yeah, probably don't have as much of a good overview of the entire situation as I might have, but let me share my screen here, and I think we can get rolling. So let's share this. Make sure I'm sharing the right stuff. Okay, can you see that there?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. So just a little bit about me. I'm Jeff Jockisch from Privacy Plan. I'm a data privacy professional. I focus on the data privacy research, data sets, and sort of the taxonomy that surrounds data privacy. And I won't go into a lot of that because I've got to leave a little bit early here. But some of my recent work sort of focuses on data brokers and the data broker landscape that I did a presentation here on the last OSS. Also very active on LinkedIn, and you can reach me on Twitter as privacy_Stan. Just don't forget that underscore, because you're going to want that underscore. I'll leave it at that. So let's have a little bit of fun here and talk about algorithms before we talk about actual legislation. And I want to sort of position this here, right? So I'm not going to talk about algorithmic regulation as much. I want to talk a little bit about what algorithms are and a little bit about how we have to think about them so that we can understand how to regulate them. And then Federico is going to talk about the legislation, and Adam's going to probably talk about the legislation and regulation a lot too. But I want to give you guys a little bit of positioning, because I think we really need to understand what algorithms and AI are and some real intrinsic problems we have there before we can really understand how to regulate them effectively, okay? So I'm going to start off here, and let's look at sort of the good and the bad. Lee Rainey and Jana Anderson of Pew Research sum it up really well, and here are some of their words. They say algorithms are instructions for solving a problem or completing a task. Recipes are algorithms, as are math equations. Computer code is algorithmic. The internet runs on algorithms, and all online searching is accomplished through them. Email knows where to go thanks to algorithms. Smartphone apps are nothing but algorithms. Computer and video games are algorithmic storytelling. Online dating and book recommendations and travel websites would not function without algorithms. GPS mapping systems get people from point A to point B via algorithms. Artificial intelligence is not but algorithms. The material people see on social media is brought to them by algorithms. In fact, everything people see and do on the web is a product of algorithms. Every time somebody sorts a column on a spreadsheet, algorithms are at play. Most financial transactions today are accomplished by algorithms. The algorithms help gadgets respond to voice commands, recognize faces, sort photos, build and drive cars, hacking, cyber attacks, cryptographic code breaking exploit, algorithms. Self-learning, self-programming algorithms are now emerging. So it's possible that in the future, algorithms may write many, if not most, algorithms. And algorithms are often elegant, incredible, useful tools to accomplish tasks. They're mostly invisible aids, augmenting human lives in increasingly incredible ways. However, sometimes the application of algorithms created with good intention lead to unintended consequences. So, unintended consequences, right? We get a lot of good things from algorithms. The downside can't be that bad, right? Well, let's talk about that. Here's my take. Replacing human intelligence with machine intelligence creates problems. There are many mysteries in this world, but that is not one of them. Understanding the ramifications of AI and how we choose to solve that problem, the problems it creates, will affect the bedrock of our civilization. Every tech brings new problems with it. AI is no different, though it may be harder to understand and predict. So we use the term algorithm and AI sort of loosely, but I think we need to understand them a little bit better to understand how to regulate, right? Algorithm is simply a process or a set of rules to calculate something or to solve a problem. We use the definition broadly in today's society. We can put more formal rules around it, specify input and output, require finite number of steps, those kinds of things, right? But that's what it is. If you look at AI, it similarly has broad definitions in general usage. The definition I prefer is this: the ability of a computer or a robot controlled by a computer to do tasks that are usually done by humans because they require human intelligence and discernment, right? But we need to understand that AI and algorithms are different things. But most people will never really understand that difference. I suggest you consider those terms synonyms in general usage, but pay attention to the difference as we move forward, right? Look closely at AI for just a second, right? There are sort of three different types, right? Most people think of AI as sort of Skynet, as sort of the all-knowing sentient network ready to destroy mankind, right? This is what we call ASI, or artificial superintelligence. There's another type called strong AI, and that's where AI is sort of as smart as we are, right? But what we're really talking about here today is weak AI or narrow AI. That's where our regulation is really focused on, right? This is machine learning, deep learning, expert systems, neural networks, those kinds of techniques. So what we call AI today is really just the very end of smart algorithms. You can sort of look at it this way, right? There's this big group of algorithms. A subset of that is artificial intelligence. A subset of that is machine learning, right? Machine learning, we often talk about today, right? You feed it data, and while you understand what comes out, you understand what comes out, you don't really understand why it comes out, right? Deep learning is an even blacker box. So let's take a look at those black boxes real quick, right? I want to make sure everybody gets this concept, because this is what's really important when I'm trying to tell you today, right? Machine learning is unlike other algorithms. It's not a step-by-step recipe. You remember when I talked about algorithms right at the start? Recipes was one of the types of algorithms. Machine learning is not like that. Machine learning is often called the black box because the processes, right? Because it processes information, inputs and outputs are not transparent. The only thing people can observe is the data that was entered in the final decisions, right? Because people have no idea how AI makes those decisions and can't view those internal workings, they lose confidence in the model that they can't fully control. One thing, one thought here on training data, it's not always clear what data is needed to train a model well, right? And why the data might be deficient. If you think about facial recognition for a moment, we know that some of these algorithms in facial recognition have problems, like with black faces, especially black female faces. About 6.5% of the population is black and female. If you've got a data set for facial recognition, is 6.5% of your data black and female? That would be what we call adequate representation in a sample, right? But what if adequate isn't enough to train your model? What if there are problems with how the algorithm works, or how the equipment collects the data, or with lighting conditions? You have to remember that people that use your algorithms in real world, they use them in the real world, not in test situations. We might need to oversample for black females in order to correct the model deficiencies, right? It sounds like a good solution, but then will that oversampling bias the software in some other way? It's a black box, right? So it's hard to say without extensive testing what's going to happen, right? Here's something interesting, some interesting data points. DARPA did an analysis of machine learning techniques and charted explainability of results versus prediction accuracy. And they found that the more accurate the model was, the less explainable it was, right? So the models are smart, but we can't easily see and understand how individual decisions are actually arrived at. Interesting, right? So let's look more closely at explainability. This is the hot dog, not hot dog classifier example used in HBO's Silicon Valley TV series. You may have seen it or heard about it, right? It turns out the machines are very good at this kind of thing, and humans aren't really. Well, they're better at it than we are. As simple as some kinds of Bayesian classifiers like this are, it can be very valuable, right? But we don't really understand how they work. How does the machine know that this is not a hot dog, right? But this is a hot dog. There's so little hot dog there. How does it really know, right? The explainability of this is hard. But let's look a little bit further, right? So how about these? Are these hot dogs, or are they legs of someone in a Chase lounger sunning themselves? This was a meme you may have seen a few years back. Humans generally can't tell the difference as well as a machine can. Are they human legs or are they hot dogs? But why, right? Is it something about the shape of the legs or the reflectivity or the color? This is what we mean about the black box of machine learning. This example isn't really important, right? Why do we really care, right? But what if you were rejected for a job based upon a black box algorithm, right? Or the algorithm made the decision that you didn't need the medication your doctor prescribed, or an algorithm told you that your daughter didn't get into the college she wanted? Would you care then, right? Sorry. What happens when you're adversely affected? Is anyone liable? How can you determine liability if there's no explainability, right? You wouldn't want to know why, wouldn't you want to know why you were adversely impacted? In fact, wouldn't you have a right to that information? Well, you might have those rights, right? And more information soon if we can regulate this stuff, right? But if you can't explain, right, how can you get the information? And if you can't have the explanation, how can we give any liability? These are some interesting questions, right? So what have we covered here that I've sort of tried to these questions I've tried to raise, right? Algorithms are everywhere. They do good and bad. Algorithms and AI are different, but people use the terms interchangeably. Artificial intelligence and machine learning in particular have a black box problem, right? And this lack of explainability, right, is going to give us problems as we try to regulate, right? This is actually from a larger presentation, so then I was going to move on to the AI landscape, which we don't have to do. But this is sort of what I wanted to sort of raise before we start talking about legislation. I know that the legislation for that Federico is going to talk about next starts to sort of try to regulate some of these things. And when it sort of mandates explainability, I want you to think about this concept here. When somebody's got a machine learning algorithm, how can we get them to explain things that are unexplainable, right? It's a bit of a problem that we need to address. So with that, I'm going to shut up and let other folks talk here.
Thank you very much, Jeff. It was an amazing presentation, and I think that you summarized pretty well the challenges of AI that AI poses on the current landscape. I would like to also share my screen. Give me a second. Here. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
First of all, my name is Federico Marengo. I am a PhD student at Bocconi University in Milano. My research topic is, or my research deals with the intersection of data protection and artificial intelligence, and in particular, which are the problems or the challenges that artificial intelligence poses on data protection. Artificial intelligence, as Jeff previously mentioned, poses a lot of challenges and a lot of problems on fundamental rights, but my focus is only on data protection because it is impossible to cover all of them in a doctoral thesis. So, and I also set up my consultancy firm This is a new company. It is Qubit Privacy. So I provide background support for other companies, and I also have some clients which I support. Well, last month, the first, it was leaked a draft of the proposal for the regulation of AI, and then officially the 21st of April, if I am right, yes, the 21st of April, the Commission said officially launched the draft proposal for the regulation of artificial intelligence. It will have a direct impact on the whole change of operators in the AI, but it will principally regulate the activity of providers of AI. Providers are the developer of AI solutions, but it also have some impact on importers of AI, distributors of AI systems, and users of AI systems. Users are those who use the AI solutions.
Federico, could you just present instead of, it just makes it a bit bigger?
Sorry?
Could you just go into present mode on PowerPoint?
Okay.
You go slideshow and then present. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, sorry.
Perfect.
Well,
yeah, there you go. Cool.
Well, the regulations it is a very long regulation, as it is usually the regulation, the legislation in the European Union, and it is only a draft, which is a draft which was drafted by the European Commission. So it is a long way to go if it finally gets enacted, but it is only a draft. It divides the artificial intelligence systems in three kind of systems: those who are not allowed, those who are heavily regulated, and those who poses a low risk. Well, I am not going to talk about the whole regulation because it is very complex. I read it, but I am not an expert on it. But I would like to show which are the three. I use the analogy with the traffic lights, and I found which are the positive things, which are the things that can be improved, and which are the things that should be or must be improved in order to get a better regulation. Of course, it is a preliminary view, and during the next couple of weeks or months, many things will surely come out. Well, first of all, in the green light, it is a general framework that regulates AI. We will later see it is the definition of AI is very, very broad, and I think that it encompasses almost everything. Almost everything it is covered by the regulation. And as I previously mentioned, it has a list of prohibited practices. That these practices poses unacceptable risks, and it says that these practices are prohibited or banned, but it has some exceptions concerning the remote biometric identification in real time. The core of the regulation is devoted to high-risk AI systems, which are systems. It also provides a long list of systems that they consider as posing high risks, and then it imposes minimum regulations concerning transparency to low-risk AI systems. Which are the prohibited in both extremes? We have the prohibited practices that, in a nutshell, are practices that manipulate human behavior or exploit information to exploit vulnerabilities of people, practices that score individuals, but that they have a disproportionate impact concerning to the gravity of the social behavior, or it devoted grand part of the regulation to real-time remote biometric identification systems, which are used by law enforcement agencies, which even though it is prohibited at the beginning, then we will see that there are a lot of exceptions whereby real-time biometric identification systems can be used. Then it regulates low-risk systems, which are chatbots, for instance, AI systems that are intended to interact with humans, emotion recognition systems, and systems that generate content which are similar to deep fakes. For instance, content that create similar or appreciably similar content to persons, humans, or places. But the core of the regulation is devoted to high-risk AI systems, as I mentioned before. Well, remote biometric identification of persons in public accessible areas. It is forbidden in real time, but you can also use this biometric identification, remote biometric identification, for post identification of persons, and it is not forbidden. Then the regulation consider these are just examples. Systems that determine the access of persons to educational or vocational training, or systems that are intended to use for recruitment, for evaluation of the creditworthiness of persons, or evaluation of systems that assess the eligibility of people for assistance benefits. Remember that all these are systems that we've seen problems recently. For instance, AI system that evaluated the eligibility of persons for public assistance benefits. We have a case in the Netherlands in which the previous government had serious concerns about this system. Then, for instance, well, we have problems. We have systems that predict the occurrence of crimes in an event of social unrest, and then systems that assist judges in courts. So these are just examples of systems that the Commission considered as having having high risk. So they need to be regulated in order to be used for users in the EU. Well, why I consider that these regulations have positive points? I think that in this point, I am not in the majority, because many people was very critical to concerning the regulation. I think that the regulation is a great step, because first of all, it is the first international regulation on the topic. To my knowledge, there is no any other regulation that covers so many countries and regulates so heavily these systems. The regulation, as it was the case of the GDPR, it is intended to have extraterritorial scope, because providers of systems of AI systems not established in the EU will have to comply with the EU. Imagine providers, US providers of systems will be bound by this regulation, and also users of these systems when the output is used in the EU. Well, it also regulates functioning high-risk AI systems, even though the regulation will be covered in general for the future. It will also be applicable to systems that are already in place if they suffer changes, if the changes are significant in the design and intended purpose. The regulation also imposes severe fines these fines are even higher than the GDPR fines, because the maximum fines are up to 30 billion euros, or 6% of the global annual turnover of the company. The regulation establishes a central register of high-risk AI systems, which is accessible to the public, but as a caveat, it has only limited information for the public. It regulates, as I mentioned before, but well, I will expand a bit more. It regulates the obligation of providers. Providers will have obligations before putting the AI systems on the market. For instance, registering the system or drawing up lengthy documentation on technical aspects of the AI system. And if you take a look at the regulation, the documentation that they have to compile is huge. The amount of information that they have to provide to national authorities will be enormous. So I think that this is a good point. And providers will also have a obligation after the system is operating, such as the post-market monitoring system. They are responsible for failures of the system. It is a kind of guarantee that the system is working well. And whenever when this is another important point, whenever the provider is established outside the EU and the law and the regulation is applicable to them, they must appoint a representative in the EU. So there is something that can be responsible for the providers. Next, I am doing well with the time, right? Okay, I go.
Yeah, all good.
Users of AI. Users are those that procure and make use of high-risk AI systems. They must monitor the operation of the system for evident abnormalities. And as I mentioned before, foreign users of AI systems are bounded by regulation in some cases. Finally, concerning the
Hey, Federico, can I ask a question? Is it right if I ask you a question on this one?
Yes, please.
Yeah. My name is Ral, and I was wondering the difference between providers and users, because I read the regulation, and to me, it seemed to be like a fine line between providers and users. For example, if I take an applicant tracking system, so recruitment, where they might buy an AI from a supplier, then might tweak it, for their own brand, for example, and then not put it in the market, but use it for their own recruitment purposes for their business. And to me, I don't know I want to know what your thoughts were on whether it's always clear cut in those kind of scenarios, whether whether that counts as putting it into the market, or you've kind of tweaked it a little bit, or you're a user.
Well, thank you very much for your question. There are some points that there aren't clear enough, and I have to be honest with you. I don't have a complete knowledge of the regulation, but what I know is that providers are responsible for. Providers, first of all, are those who produce or develop the system. Then, when another company procures the system and makes use of the system, according to the instructions given by the provider, it is a user. But if the provider changes the purposes of the AI system, or makes some changes that change or modify some important features of the system, then the user will be responsible and not the provider. So, but you are right. There might need some fine tuning in this regard, because there might be some situations that haven't been so specifically detailed as you have find. as you have found.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's because I know most companies are not going to want to be a provider because, like if you said, it's the massive paperwork and onus on them when you're a provider. So that's good to know.
Yeah, yes.
In
principle, yeah. Sorry, Alan. Go on.
Sorry, I was just going to make a bit of a technical illustration of why that's the case, because you can only verify the behavior of a machine learning system, for example, in the context of its target of use. So if you were building an application tracking system for recruitment and you verified that it didn't suffer from accuracy, bias, or robustness issues when dealing with the UK market, you may then deploy that system outside of its approved context of use, for instance, in the German market, and find that the accuracy was significantly different because of the data-driven nature of it. The other reason there's obligations on end users is because there is change over time in either the concepts or the data. So the end users have to be obliged to monitor for changes in the data that the machine learning system is seeing so that they can react to those changes. And that's why there are some surprising obligations on the end users.
Yeah, I think it's for me. I know what one concern I have is the difference between the two, because they are onerous when it comes to being a provider. So it's one thing I'm curious about.
Yeah, maybe this kind of situations, I think that there will be debated during the legislative process, and I think that and in this case it will be very important the feedback from the civil community, from the community in the sessions. So well, and finally, importers and distributors, they also have some responsibilities, because according to the regulation, they must put into the market only high-risk AI systems that comply with the provisions. So then it will be difficult to for them to prove, or for them to know when a system is compliant with the regulation. But the regulation, or the draft regulation, puts forces them to know or to establish whether the system is compliant with the regulation, and if it is not, they must halt the operation, or they must suspend the distribution of the system.
So can I ask a question? You mentioned a word that I want to make sure that it's actually, we just talk about the implications. You mentioned the word accountable. So if you go back one slide, right? So
yes,
people who put these AIs out there, right? Are they now start to be accountable for what they do? Because at the moment, the software industry is being very good at, not being accountable for anything.
Well, not really, because supposing that the system is considered as a high-risk AI system. First of all, it must be covered by the regulation. Then the regulation will apply to systems that are already in place only if they are subject to significant changes in their design or intended purpose. But if the system remains the same without updated, so it will not be covered by the regulation.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the word accountable, like where in terms of almost connect with liabilities. Is this introducing a new layer of liability to the creators of this system?
Well, yeah, well, yes, for sure. But for the future products, not for products that are already in the market. Let's say Palantir or these kind of systems, if they are already in place, they will be able to operate the systems, but they won't be able to do it in the future.
Okay.
So, well, moving on, I also think that a positive point of the regulation or the draft of the regulation, the enforcement, even though the institutional scheme or the institutional architecture of the regulation is very complex and difficult to disentangle and difficult to understand. It places on market surveillance authorities. It says that market surveillance authorities will have full access to the training, validation, and testing datasets used by the provider, and upon request, to the source code. I think that this may be really burdensome obligation for providers, and I don't think it will be well received by the industry, but in the regulation is these authorities will be able to get access to this information. And then if the market surveillance authority considers that a system presents a risk, it can carry out an evaluation and consider that if it says that it has an acceptable level of risk, it can force the operator to take measures, including withdrawing the high-risk AI system. So, which means that they have a broad power to monitor and regulate how the systems operate. Finally, one positive thing regarding biometric remote biometric identification. It is one of the most hotly debated topics on the academic arena, because it is said, well, RBI destroys privacy, but the exception, on the one hand, there is a safeguard, because well, the exception only apply if it is subject, if the authority that uses remote biometric identification makes an assessment of the seriousness of the situation and foresees the consequences of its use. But the most important safeguard is that they need to require prior authorization to a judicial authority or another independent authority in the country. So I think that asking prior judicial authorization is a pretty strong safeguard for remote biometric identification. Of course, it also has its problems. It also has its issues. But if we have to balance between safety and the existence of safeguards, I think that it can be found a balance between them. But I know that it is pretty debatable, this provision. Well, moving on. Yellow light, I consider yellow light those provisions that can be improved, so, and to get a better legislative product. First of all, personally, I don't like the word users, because sometimes we get confused with the user or individual. So I don't know. And then I also wait for the comments on the technical area. Why don't we can put it developers of AI systems, or no? But no. Well, here I made a mistake, because users are those who use the system and not those that deploy. But can these organizations be named as deployers? This is a question that I have. Then the definition of AI system, it is extremely broad. I think that the intention or the aim was to cover everything, but I am not my background is in law, so I don't have technical or computer science background. So, but from what I have been studying for my thesis, I've seen that it covers pretty much everything, because it covers machine learning systems. Then it goes on saying that reinforcement, supervised and supervised learning, which is the three kinds of learning. Then it covers logic and knowledge-based approaches, which are expert systems, and statistical approaches, Bayesians, other kind of statistical approaches. I think it is. Then Adam, please correct me if I am wrong, but I think it covers everything out there.
Even spreadsheets.
Even spreadsheets.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so I am right with my assertion that it covers everything.
Yeah.
Then the institutional setting, it is not very clear. The regulation plans to create another supranational institution, the European Artificial Intelligence Board, which will have some sort of the same function that the European Data Protection Board has concerning data protection, but concerning artificial intelligence, which is oversee in general the functioning of the regulation, establishing guidelines, supporting national authorities in the application of the law. It aims at the harmonization of the application of the regulation in national countries. Then, at the national level, it is very confusing whether countries must create new agencies or can use well-established agencies to supervise or to monitor the law and enforce the law. Then individual rights, it is not, the top individual rights are not clearly stipulated, and it grants very little rights to individuals, apart from being informed that they are interacting with the AI system, which is the base level right. It doesn't stipulate any right to request or any right for transparency. It leaves everything to the hands of national authorities, which well, it is a policy, legislative policy, but I don't think it is okay, which can have institutional enforcement and also individual rights. Finally, the conformity assessment, the regulation provides for a conformity assessment, which is a kind of in the vast majority of cases, will be a self-declaration that the system is in compliance with the regulation. But well, it will be very, very challenging to take it into practice, because I imagine that many providers will say that the system is in compliance with the regulation, even all the more if they are based abroad. And this system is completely different, for instance, what the system of the DPAI, which is a data protection impact assessment, because it is not overseen by a data protection officer. It doesn't have to consult with data protection authorities. So I think that this could be also improved in further readings of the regulation in the council or in the parliament.
Not a question,
Finally,
Federico.
Yes,
not a
yes,
question, but more of a
statement. I've seen a hand. Yes.
I wanted to say on that one, I think for me, the conformity bit was the biggest bit of confusion for me when I read it, because I wasn't sure when you do a self-assessment one, when you're supposed to do a third-party assessment, conformity assessment, and both of them when a user is supposed to do one. I know the provider I think it always is a third party one. I'm not sure, but that was the biggest confusion for me on that one of the whole regulation.
So in the final draft, so in the leaked version, Annex 2 indicated that self-assessment would be permissible for some systems. In the final, well, not final, but in the draft that was actually announced, that's all removed. So I think for now, self-assessment's actually off the table.
Okay, well, that's one less confusing part. But I read the leaked one actually.
No, if I am not wrong, self-assessment are already in place for many systems. I will check it later, but some systems that carry high risk, like remote biometric identification, will need a third-party assessment, but many of them will be self-assessment. So this will be problematic.
Do they have to publish the data of the self-assessment?
Sorry?
Do they have to publish the data of the self-assessment for peer review?
Well, this is the short answer is no. They have to compile some documentation. In fact, they have. I am talking about providers. They have an obligation to draw up technical documentation, but this documentation has to be is reserved for national authorities upon request if they need to check the functioning of the system. But for instance, even though they have the obligation to register the system in a public registry, they don't need to publish the data with which the system was created. They only have to provide to the register a lot of information, but nothing concerning to the data. Yes, it has to hand a copy of the declaration of conformity, which basically says that the system complies with the regulation. So, but not concerning the data. The data, from what I've seen, is not available for the public.
What about consequences for self-certifying, the saying it's okay when it's not okay, or basically somebody who just go, we self-certify that we good, but they haven't actually even done the work, or they haven't done proper due diligence, and then they get caught later on?
Well, the system established at the end penalties, administrative penalties. For some kind of behaviors, it is up to 6% of 30 million euros, but it is not the case for forging or for lying in the self-declaration. I think that for lying in the self-declaration, it will be up to 4% of the annual global turnover, or up to 20 million euros. Fine, which is high. Not for Google, not for the big four, the big five, but it is for a startup. It is a huge fine. Cool. So finally, what I think it is the most concerning part of the regulation, and again, it is a first reading. So I hope you can enlighten my view with other critics. The part of remote biometric identification, even though I have my doubts at the beginning, even though I say that, well, some safeguards they are provided to the population, because in the case of real-time biometric identification for law enforcement purposes, the authorities need to have need to require prior judicial authorization. But then the prohibition of carrying out real-time biometric identification is very, very limited, because the provision says it needs to be carried out in real time for law enforcement purposes in public accessible areas. And then it lists some uses. It can be used for the search of victims, for threat of terrorist attack, or crime listed in this decision 202, which lists a long list of crimes. But for instance, there are uses that are not forbidden. I am talking about real-time biometric identification. You can use real-time biometric identification in hospitals, public schools, if they are not publicly accessible areas, or you can use real-time remote biometric identification in the private sector, for instance, in transport companies or shopping centers. So this might be addressed this should be addressed in future readings in the Parliament and the Council, because it can be very problematic. And finally, as I mentioned before, I think that the transparency obligation towards individuals are pretty limited and almost inexistent, because it only allows individuals to know that they are interacting with an AI system, but we as individuals will not have access to the data with which the system will use, or at least with the metrics, with the parameters, with all the technical data, which is important for us to know if the system is prone to discrimination, or if the system will create will create more discrimination on disadvantaged group of the society. Then
ask you a question on that, Federico. Why?
Yes.
Why do you think that's a bad thing? Let me flip that back to you. Why do you think, especially for both for companies and for individuals, why do you think that's a bad thing? Because let's say we're using an AI system. If I've got any of your personal data, you can do a subject access request, and then I'm going to have to tell you what personal data I've at least got. And then I think it's very hard now for most companies, especially globally, based companies, to provide privacy notices that aren't 20, 30 pages long, and that are clear, transparent, and readable by most data subjects. And so I kind of feel like this is actually a good point, because if I'm then going to have to try and explain an AI really, really clearly, and that's going to be like another document, and it is, and where do you put it, how do you incorporate it, how do you not make it, how do you make it really clear cut, just to try and get it into one page, for example. So I thought it was a good point. That's what I was trying to say. What do you think to that?
Well, I think that the documentation or some information concerning the metrics or the values or the parameters that are considered or are important in order to take some decisions, they need to have they need to be available for end users. When I say end users, I mean I'm talking about individuals who are subject to the decision, or subject to the output of the AI system. Imagine that I don't know, you apply for a credit, or you apply for a social assistance, and all of a sudden you get rejected, and you never know why your application was rejected. You may apply for SAR, and it will depend on the public administration, or it will depend on the company if they want to give you the information. And if they give you the information, they will give you the information that does not necessarily relate with the rationale behind the decision. Because then the next slide I will address this issue. Looking forward, which are some topics that, or some points that we could address in the future? Well, I think that some of the points that we were talking about may do well in including in the legislative process, especially. I think that it will be a very positive thing to improve the rights for individuals, particularly these rights that are hotly debated in the GDPR concerning the individuals, or especially I haven't included here, but the right not to be subject to automated decisions, which is there is a very hot discussion concerning whether data subject have a right to be to obtain an explanation, or they have only a right to know some basic rationale of the system. Well, I think that if this will be the final text, and this text finally gets into or enter into force, I think that maybe the GDPR could help in some point. For instance, fair processing provisions in the GDPR will play a role, because with fair processing, every time that an AI system is using personal data, we can say, well, the processing that you are doing is not fair, it has biases, it promotes discrimination, so you have to stop or to modify the decision, and we have some rights in the GDPR, but well, it is another piece of legislation and not the AI regulation. And the same can be said concerning transparency obligation, even though transparency obligations are not included in the text of this draft. We may use some rights from the GDPR, Article 13 and 14, and the right to access Article 15, concerning meaningful information about the logic involved in the automatic decision, or asking or receiving information about the significance and the envisaged consequences of the processing. But again, these are not clear. These provisions can help, but to some extent, because this is not clear, and we can discuss the whole night concerning what is the logic involved behind the system, what is the significance of the consequences of the processing. So it would be a great opportunity to clarify these provisions, and not to force data subjects to rely on these provisions to get access or to get more information. And finally, maybe it would be a good point to include some kind of data protection officer for AI systems, like an AI officer, in order to help with the compliance of the regulation. This is my take. Sorry, I extended a lot of the time, but well, I hope you get a broad idea of what the AI regulation draft entails. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time, and I leave you, Adam, the floor, and I'm really looking forward to listen to you.
No, that's pretty
Thanks,
good.
Federico. That was great.
Very good overview of where we are.
So I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the points that Federico covered, and I'm also going to talk about implementation, because there's a long way to go between now and the necessary detail to enforce this law. So first of all, I'm Adam Leon Smith. I'm Chief Technology Officer of a company called Dragonfly. And part of my role is doing research and development on AI and bias. And I'm on the UK's AI Standardization Committee and a representative to the EU's new Standardization Committee that's being formed to support this legislation, amongst other things. And I'm also the editor of the ISO IEC standards coming out on AI bias. So I've been working kind of a little bit in the background on some of this stuff for a few years now, including working with UK Accreditation Service, the Information Commissioner's Office, and the whole regulatory ecosystem in the UK. And it's going to be really interesting to see what the UK does here, because on the one hand, this isn't directly applicable to the UK, because the UK is arguably no longer part of the, well, it's no longer part of the European Union. But the EU is making a big stand here, and they're saying we're going to differentiate our AI on quality and acceptability to society, which is a major difference to China and currently to the United States. And it will be interesting to see which countries jump on board with the EU approach. So you might see countries like Japan or New Zealand that jump on this as well. There is going to be a bigger impact on tech, I think, from this than GDPR. Not in terms of the whole business sectors. You know, I think if you're running a non-tech business, you were impacted by GDPR. This is very much going to be limited to tech companies that are using AI. And it's going to be quite interesting to see how the boundaries are drawn around accountability and responsibility, as you were asking there, Dennis, because it isn't fully clear from the legislation in its current form. So I just want to start talking about what is AI, because I just want to be clear. I know Jeff was talking earlier about algorithms. It's not the algorithm that's being regulated. It's the whole system that uses an artificial intelligence technique or approach. And Annex 1 of the legislation breaks down what that means. Now, as expected, that includes machine learning, which is the subfield of AI where most of these risks have originally arisen. And by the way, this is the actual draft legislation on the screen. The second technique and approach, as Federico said, is expert systems. But I think this language needs tightening up, because you could potentially draw systems which are not considered AI into this definition. But this one is significant. So statistical approaches. So that could be calculating a mean average in a spreadsheet for a creditworthiness system. It would certainly include the off-qual algorithm, which was probably a spreadsheet, which was the subject of much debate in the UK last year for good reason. And it also includes search and optimization methods. If you think about, if you have a maze and you're writing an algorithm for an intelligent agent to find its way out of the maze, you might tell it to keep turning left or keep turning right until it gets to the exit. That is a search technique, so would fall in scope of this list. So this is the first thing to realize. The definition of AI is probably as wide as they could have made it here. And whether or not this will be refined, particularly item C, we will see as the legislation goes to its later readings. Another thing I want to say is there's a whole regulatory ecosystem inferred by this legislation. Federico touched on it as market surveillance authorities. But there's market surveillance authorities, there's notified bodies, notifying authorities, there's the EU AI board, there's the standardization bodies, there's subcontracted conformity assessment providers, and it's going to be left to member states to really figure out some of the detail of that. So if this was to be adopted in the UK, you might see the Information Commissioner's Office acting as a notified body and subcontracting to conformity assessment providers, independent audit bodies, which are accredited by the UK Accreditation Service. So you can imagine how that existing ecosystem would be adopted for this. In terms of the scope, and Federico covered this brilliantly, so I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but this annex previously in the leaked document did talk about self-assessment, and it doesn't anymore. It only identified a couple of these as requiring independent audit. But you're talking about, let's take this one, okay? So the UK Accreditation Service in the UK sorry, not UK Accreditation Service, UCAS, what does that stand for? The Central University Clearinghouse has had issues where people's personal stories or the free text part of their university application, when people from certain ethnicities write those personal stories, the system determines that it's fraudulent to a higher statistical degree. So there's a real problem with access to education that's been seen in the UK by using AI systems in this way. Recruitment is a very well-known area where there's been lots of problems with AI systems. Personally, my company makes an AI system that does task allocation in Jira, and we recommend the best developer to fix a particular problem. That's now in scope of this legislation because we're allocating tasks to workers based on machine learning. And for the financial services industry, we have creditworthiness. I can't see it right now, but there it is. Evaluating the creditworthiness of a natural person or establishing their credit score. So there's a big scope here, and I'm going to dive into a couple of really specific areas and point out some pretty huge problems with them. So, and I should say, I fully support this legislation. It's going in the right direction, but there's a huge amount of work to do before any of this can really be done. I'm going to give a few examples here. So this article, Article 10, is all about data and data governance. And there's some really good stuff in here because your data is ultimately, it can often be the source of your problem. Not always, but it is often the source of your problem. One of the things that exists in here is that the training, validation, and test data sets need to be relevant, representative, free from errors, and complete. They shall have the appropriate statistical properties, including where applicable as regard to persons or groups of persons to which the high-risk AI system is intended to be used. The characteristics of the data sets may be met at the level of individual data sets or a combination thereof. So what are the problems with this? Well, first of all, what does representative mean? If I take a representative data set, let's say I have two classes of let's say people, and I'm trying to categorize them into A or B. So this legislation is implying that I need a 50-50 split of class A and class B in my training data. So what happens if I later find bias and want to correct for that by adding more data of one particular class? Well, it's no longer representative, is it? It is no longer representing statistical properties, even though I'm trying to make the system more accurate as required by other articles. Another example is if I oversample class B in order to improve accuracy for class A, then I'm going to reduce, sorry, if I oversample class B to improve accuracy for class B, I'm going to reduce the accuracy for class A in other ways that I might not have anticipated. Another problem here is this statement. The characteristics of these data sets may be met at the level of individual data sets or a combination thereof. You can't assess individual data sets. You have to do things at statistically significant volumes. And even when doing things at large volumes, you have to be quite cognizant of the statistical issues that we face here. If you take 6 objects and try and pick 2, the probability of getting an even split between class A and class B is not 50%, it's a third. So there's quite a lot of complex things inside this data set issue that needs to be broken down into a lot more detail than Article 10. This isn't appropriate for enforcement. Furthermore, it's also not addressing the actual problem, which is the accuracy of the system and whether it's free from things like bias. Excessive focus on the data may prove to be harmful and may lead to conflicts between different articles of the law. Not to say that it isn't an absolutely huge problem that needs addressing, but there's a lot of detail here that still needs to be worked through. There is a whole annex on technical documentation, which I think, Federico, you said it was a lot, Personally, I've worked on high-risk systems, critical national infrastructure, ones that affect lives, and I don't think it is a lot. I think it's a necessary level of documentation for any high-risk system. But what's interesting is they're actually codifying the contents of your tech documentation, your tech specs, and your test plans and things into such a high-level law. Moving down into page 53. We start to talk about some really important stuff, accuracy and robustness. And I'm actually not going to talk about cybersecurity. Oh, no, I'll talk about cybersecurity as well. These systems have to have an appropriate level of accuracy. So what does that mean? You know, because we know that statistical systems have a degree of inaccuracy. So how am I going to work out what an appropriate level of accuracy is? Is it okay to be wrong 10% of the time when I'm dealing with a recruitment system? The answer is we don't know. We barely have the methods to actually assess that in a scientific and structured way. These methods are well known in research and in the literature, but the industry best practices are rarely there, especially when you're dealing with end users as opposed to the developers of AI systems, data scientists.
Can I ask you a point on that, Adam? Because it's one thing I've wondered with this regulation, and more in general, even now when it comes to AI, because I work primarily in recruitment and with ATSs. And one thing that I can say for the industry that we struggle with is finding, should be accurate, should be robust, should be fair, transparent. Even now, we try to do that, but it's that assessing. Where do you even go to find some resources for an assessment? Even the outcomes, if it's biased, finding how to, it's easy. What if a tool ranks someone? How do you know? If it's biased is the most basic level.
Mm-hmm.
We struggle to kind of find those assessments, how we assess it. Where would you go, for example, to kind of find?
Oh, well, that's what I've been doing for the past few years, because when we built the AI system internally that did task allocation, I had to spend 6 months reading scientific papers to figure out how to do it. And
I wish I had 6 months.
Most of them were about classification, not ranking algorithms, as you say. So that's why I've been working for the past few years with ISO to try and standardize with the whole world, every nation state that's signed up to the International Standards Organization, to come up with best practices around that. So that's being published in January next year.
Okay.
And I'll come back to standards, because one of the problems is this is an EU legislation, not a global legislation. And what we do at an international level may not be what the EU chooses to do.
Okay.
So robustness and cybersecurity are directly related. Robustness is the degree to which a system can continue to perform when exposed to all possible data. So you may have heard of adversarial attacks. So I can take an image of myself, change some pixels, and a specific facial recognition algorithm will think I'm someone else, right? Whoever I want to be. This is a really complex area that leverages security vulnerabilities in the internal feature space of neural networks, and in particular with deep learning, that are very, very difficult to evaluate. Sure, I can do it if I'm in a lab doing some research. Sure, I've got access to the whole model, everything that went into building it. When you obtain a model from someone else or your adversarial actor, what you have to do is to try and create a duplicate of that model that you train yourself that tries to replicate that functionality. And then you have to spend a lot of time testing as many different variations as you can. And if you can't do that, and you can't always, you basically have to check every possible input. So if you're testing facial recognition technology, you might need to run everyone in the world's face through in order to determine if that risk exists. So there is currently no best practices around testing robustness of machine learning. At least there isn't a formal way if you're a formal mathematician type, but actually doing that in the field or doing it as part of a software development process is extremely hard.
But Adam, what about if the companies had to publish things like threat models and basically the attack trees that they worked on and the scenario that they cared about? Because again, if you take three, AI developers, machine learning, algorithm developers, right? And one has a huge amount of detail, one has, all sorts of information. You can see that they really thought about it through. And in a way, your job is almost to see, are there any gaps in the way they were thinking? Maybe one that didn't do a lot of stuff, and then the third one that asks you to sign an NDA and clearly doesn't want to share anything with you. You know exactly which one has thought about these things, right? And a lot of the things about cybersecurity is actually about, have you considered some of these scenarios, right? Because if you have, a lot of the times you can actually do something about it, right?
So there are AI cybersecurity scenarios where threat modeling would totally help. Okay, so one of them is data poisoning. So let's say your algorithm is trading commodities prices, oil prices. You might want to scan social media and the news on the internet in order to predict changes in the price and trade on that. Mm-hmm. But if someone can take control of a news site and influence your model, they can change what you do. So those kind of data poisoning attacks, absolutely, you can threat model that.
What I'm saying is that companies had to share those, right? Because just the fact of sharing that means that A, if you want to do that test, you don't start from scratch. B, already raise the bar for how they should be thinking about robustness in cybersecurity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Threat models would be a great addition to this legislation, and they may end up in here as well. But adversarial attacks on deep learning specifically, it is more akin to buffer overflow attacks, but with none of the variables inside the code making any sense, if you see what I mean. You can't translate from the functionality into code in the way you can with traditional logic. So there's a huge set of vulnerabilities there around these adversarial attacks that are really difficult to find.
Do you also have cover here the describability of the algorithm, like how much of a black box the algorithm actually is at the end of the day?
So it is a black box in a lot of cases. And again, it's because the internal workings aren't understandable. You can empirically do different things and you can establish probabilistic relations that help you understand how it's working. But it is much more of a black box than traditional logic. There's nothing in here, as Federico said, that requires explainability. And I don't think there's anything in GDPR either, although it was at some point and it sort of ended up in the introduction, but there's no actual obligation for explainability in either pieces of legislation.
Isn't that a gap?
It depends. I'm sure there's been hot debates had about this. The problem is it's not easily achievable in many cases to provide an explanation of why something specifically happened. It can be, there's lots of research on this, so it is a growing field, but yeah, it's a gap in machine learning in terms of a quality gap.
Sure, but especially if we're regulating this, right? Like one of the things we should be pushing is transparency of decision making, right?
Indeed, but you can't regulate science into inventing things. It just isn't possible with many algorithms.
Why not?
Okay, so it talks more about security here. Now, one of the reasons I say that threat models may end up being part of this is page 64. This Article 40. So I just told you about all the gaps and problems, right? The legislative body is not going to solve for that. What they've written in here is they're going to publish the technical standards in the official journal of the European Union, and then they will effectively be applicable within this legislation. So when the JTC 21 of Senelec, which is part of the European Commission standardization group, determines that something is applicable, they'll publish it, and it will effectively become part of this law. So there are a number of different standards projects going on within ISO. They've just launched a piece of a joint work between the security committees and the AI committees to look at exactly the issues we were just talking about. There are standards on testing, on quality evaluation and bias and risk assessment all in the works. And what will be interesting is whether the European Committee says we're going to adopt this global standard, which is going to be good for trade, but may not hold to Europe's view here to differentiate themselves based on the matters covered by this legislation. Or the European Union may start projects to go and write new versions of those standards. And I think one area they'll particularly do that in is with the different high-risk use cases. So I gave an example before of what is the required accuracy level for an applicant tracking system versus something safety critical. I think what the EU will start to do is to kick off specific projects for each use case. So around recruitment systems, they'll develop an accuracy standard that applies specifically, or a technical standard that applies specifically to the risks relating to recruitment and defines minimum accuracy levels. So it'll be very interesting to see how this develops. So that was the end of my quick jump through the legislation. I see we've got Jeff back as well. And I think we should probably move to questions and discussion.
One question for me, when is the expected date for this to go live?
I've seen 2023 and 2024 written down, but I think it's speculative.
Yes, I think that this is speculative because nobody knows. First of all, nobody knows if the regulation will pass, both in the council and the parliament. So some people says, as Adam said before, 25, 23, 24 maybe, and then 2 years more for entering into force. But this is pure speculation.
But even if they don't, right, you're bound to have similar regulations spreading around the world, right? So this is definitely an area that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and GDPR covers a lot of this already. If you're processing personal data, you should be doing a lot of this through an AI system. You should be doing a lot of this already. And I won't comment too much on why that isn't being enforced as much as I'd personally like to see.
Yeah, we talked about that once already, right?
Well, concerning the obligations to GDPR, I am really interested because my research is about GDPR and artificial intelligence, and there are a lot of unanswered questions in the GDPR concerning artificial intelligence, especially when it comes to explainability, when it comes to use of the data, what data should be public, what data should be kept on the providers. So this for me is gold. I still have to digest the regulation, but for those like me who work in data protection, this will give us a lot of answers that are lacking in the GDPR. Of course, if any time that an artificial intelligence system works with or process personal data, GDPR will also apply. So it will be a convergence between both regimes.
That's right. There's a paper by Luciano Floridi, you might know,
yes.
Sandra Wachter, about whether GDPR requires explainability. And the conclusion is it doesn't. It was originally included and the normative part of the regulation was removed and the recital was left.
Yes,
so it's kind of inferred, but not.
Well, there are dozens of papers on explainability because it was a expressed topic whether we as data subject has a right to an explanation when confronted or when subjected to an automatic decision. I tend to agree with them that it is not expressly stated the right to an explanation because it is only in the recitals, and the recitals has no binding force. But at the same time, we do have the right to contest a decision. So if I am subjected to an automated decision, I have the right to challenge, to contest the decision. So how can I challenge the decision if I don't know on what grounds it was rendered? So I think that building a case on the right to challenge a decision, we have something to get or some information on which we can say, well, yes, you're right. I should be dismissed. I shouldn't be hired or something else.
Do you know what? Coming back on that
think,
point, also go on.
Just go on, Ronald. I've forgotten now.
Oh, sorry.
Come back to it.
Sorry. What I was going to say, Federico, Joe, on that, in principle, I totally agree, and I think that a data subject should have that right, and they should explain. But you know what? I thought this regulation was really good, and especially if there's like standards that are produced, like you said, Adam, that would be really, really good for businesses. Because I work in-house for a global company, work across about 60 different countries or more. We don't track them anymore, how many. Do you know what though? The other side of me thinks that while that'd be good for data subjects, it'd be really good. It would be really hard unless you're a tech company or you're working the AI space for a company like I think you do, Adam, with Dragonfly. You're producing them. I think companies that are not tech or don't work in that space are going to find it really hard to have the skills in-house to be able to just answer the explainability. And that's working with data scientists, your data scientist team together are still going to find it really hard to produce that documentation and to comply with it on top of everything else that the compliance function in data protection is already doing. Because like I know we won't get extra resources, and as a function, they're always under-resourced privacy. So that's my worry, is that it just will be, a monolith task to achieve. Particularly for companies who are not tech and are not even in tech or perhaps are not working the AI space.
Yeah, but they can work with providers that are specialists on it, right? On that level.
You can to a degree, but bearing in mind liability suppliers are always going to be are not going to give concrete answers. If I say, well, tell me exactly how I want to know what process I can implement to ensure that your tech won't produce a certain bias, they might point you in the direction, but they're not going to give you the answer.
Yeah, but AI is a bit more toxic. Like that's like you're saying, well, my company or these companies they're not geared to to deal with toxic materials or radioactive materials, so they shouldn't have to describe how they handle it. They should just allow to have a nuclear reactor in the background and hope for the best, right? So some of these AI stuff, I think some of these things, like it changes the game of how some of the decisions I make, right? So you're saying a company have a system that they don't understand exactly how it works, but they're making mission critical decisions based on top of that.
That's true, but I think the sheer complexity of AI itself is different. I do think it is different. It is of such even to myself to understand it, it is vastly different to understanding other areas of privacy. That's just my own thoughts on it. But I see what you're saying. We should be able to do it. I think the realities of it are different.
To make things easier for business, there is some provisions in this regulation to support innovation similar to the ICO sandbox that exists now if you're doing something funky with data. So the Data Protection Authority sandbox. I'm also part of a not-for-profit called For Humanity, and we've developed a GDPR certification for AI. So you might be familiar with the provisions within GDPR for certificates. So rather than wait till there's a complaint, you go and you get audited or something in advance, you get a certificate, and it gives you some degree of protection for liability. So we've been working with the UK Data Protection Authority. We've engaged with CNIL, with Switzerland. I've forgotten how many different EU data protection authorities we've engaged with trying to build a certification scheme consistently across the European Union and the UK, so that companies can go and get a certificate early on in their development stage or before they go live that gives them some protection. And you'd be surprised how keen business is on this. When I talk
What's it called, Adam? Sorry.
The not-for-profit's called For Humanity.
Okay.
Yeah, the URL is forhumanity.center, the American spelling of center. And businesses really like this idea, because if you're building Highrisk AI tech right now and you're selling to 10 customers, each of those 10 customers has a data protection authority. And particularly in the UK, the data protection officer, and particularly in the UK, the data protection authority does make quite a lot of strict guidance about AI available on their website in the context of GDPR. So you get certified once, and then you give your certificate to every company. At the moment, the data protection officers all ask different questions and are all confused about bias, and there's no streamlining of the process, right? So if businesses can go and comply with a single scheme, get certified, and then send that certificate off to their customers and get legal protection, they're going to be over the moon. AI providers, at least, the good ones.
I really like that, Adam. I didn't know about that company or that organization. I just posted another company that does something sort of similar. It's a startup called Verifiably that tries to provide some sort of framework and certification for algorithmic fairness and other things as well. But I think they just started up.
So one more I have to say, Adam, where I think, I'm still, struggling to get my head around is the whole lack of describability and black boxiness. And I actually, it almost feels like saying that because, a particular application, can have other side effects. Let's say buffer overflows, right? You can argue like a buffer overflow is a side effect of an application, right? And I cannot model all of those. Like, I'm not actually going to verify it. Well, look, my instinct here is actually tells me that, as we move more into this AI and machine learning world and the side effects become, so potential so greater, it almost reminds me, I don't know if you read the book from Kevin Kelly, right? The Inevitable, and some of the things he talks about the future. And he talks about a lot of the AI that we want to see in some cases is actually highly dependable. It's almost like, you almost don't want variation on AI, right? It's almost like if I go in my car, I don't want a car to have a problem with the day or other things. I want him to do certain things really, really well. So I feel that there's a path here, which is we almost want to reduce the scope of what's possible with a particular algorithm, and then almost treat any variation of that algorithm as a bug, right? Almost as a vulnerability. You know what I mean? Like if you say, here's an algorithm, here's the 10 things you're supposed to do, and here's how you're supposed to do it, and at scale, right? Like here's the clues, here's the data, here's the inputs, here's the outputs. You almost want to treat any variation of that, again, let the community, let's have, public assessment of this, but any variation of that should be seen as a vulnerability, right?
And
it's an interesting way to think about it.
It's impossible to get there at the moment with the current level of science. I mean, when we talk about explainability, what we really mean is we're going to throw some things at it and then throw some other things at it and see if we can work out which thing we threw at it change the output. In an algorithmic, a model agnostic way, that's the way you do it. So you can't sit there under legislation and say that you can describe how it's working.
No, but you can legislate that there has to be a way, or there's levels of describeness of a particular algorithm, right?
Yeah, sure. You could legislate that they have to be able to describe it with 90% confidence. Something like that, right?
But
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I have a question. But isn't possible to give in a simple way some kind of important metrics for individuals? I'm not talking about the whole display or the whole bunch of metrics that data scientists use, but for instance, as we see in the nutrition label field, that we quickly recognize that, well, if this product has a lot of fat, this product has a lot of protein, well, which is better, the product that has a lot of salt or the product that has little salt? Well, I can say that without being a without being a specialist, I know that little salt is good for my health. So, for instance, disparity, I would be interested in knowing the disparate impact of the algorithm or the efficiency in even if in a simple form, and even though it doesn't satisfy the standards of the industry, at least for customers or for individuals at the individual level, would it be possible to design a kind of framework in order to give them understandable, easy, and user-friendly information? This is an honest question.
It's definitely desirable. And there's a lot of research going on how we do it. We sometimes call that interpretability instead of explainability. So explainability is like your support team can explain why something happened to your tech team. Interpretability is that the user can get information through the user interface, or they can push a button on the robot and say, why did you do that? It's that end-to-end explanation of why things happen. And that is absolutely the goal, but it cannot be done at the moment. Speaking generally across most algorithms, it can't be done in an accurate, reliable way. And I suspect that's why both sets of legislation have steered clear of saying that and have stuck to, you have to have human oversight. So you have to be able to say, I need this decision to be reconsidered by a human.
Yes. Well, this is an important point that I missed in my presentation. Yes, human oversight, it is important. But again, what is the point of human oversight? As you mentioned, some systems are still impossible to interpret, impossible even for a data scientist. What is the point of having a data scientist or a human behind the decision that should have or must have the power to overrule the decision or dismiss the decision if even he or she doesn't understand what is going on in the system. And last question. Are some instances where it's possible to use simpler algorithms than more complex algorithms? For instance, some cases where linear regression or decision trees, even though it doesn't, this doesn't have the same accuracy that neural networks or more complex systems. Well, in some cases, these algorithms are more easier to explain, right?
Yes, it is. With certain algorithms, it is easier, much easier. But the legislation in front of us, both sets of legislation prioritize accuracy over explainability.
Okay.
Maybe that'll change in 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
And you know what's interesting, Adam, hearing you talk about how you throw, explainability at the moment with algorithms is, throwing something at it and see how it responds. Because I know from a legal perspective, someone such as myself would go to a data scientist, explain this to me in a way that I can understand. And then if you give me literally an answer like that, there's almost a third layer, because then I think, to your point, Federico, am I even going to want to, as a company, put something up that tries to explain something, because it ends up being wrong, which it could be. The legal ramifications are that I've put something up that's incorrect to consumers, and then we could get fined for that by the FTC for it not being what we're not doing, what we're saying.
Well, they wouldn't know either, right?
It's not a situation I'd want to be in.
Yeah, but okay, but look a little bit in the future, right? So one of the ways, kind of like I kind of walk backward, on my thinking of this from Skynet, right? Okay, if we assume that there is a path where we are creating, right, a set of artificial intelligence, right, who are way beyond our control, it won't happen overnight, right? Like it would start to creep in, and there's also an idea of, we have to be very careful of building systems that we don't understand, right? Because there has to be properties, there has to be things you can detect from systems that behave independently than systems that, do the stuff that we want to do. So I actually think that the market will push for this clarity, because all you have to do is imagine what will happen the day that some decisions, some people die, some major thing occur from an algorithm that when you do an analysis, the answer is, well, we don't really know how it works, right?
And that'll be the day it changes.
Well, yeah, and I think the market will push that, and I feel the way we say, well, we can't explain these algorithms, it's basically a reflection maybe of our understanding of machine learning today. But I think we should be pushing the market for accountability, right? We should be rewarding, the understanding of what these algorithms are doing, because fundamentally we're using these algorithms, these machine learning or AI systems for scale, right? To be able to very quickly determine an X-ray that has cancer versus one that doesn't, right? Very quickly make decisions. And I think that if you have a mode where you end up, creating, simpler models that also scale, that have some elements of machine learning, but are easy to explain, then we almost want a system that rewards those, right?
Yeah. And it is a huge area of research, and it is limited, I should say, to really neural networks rather than expert systems. This problem, there's a lot of people working on it. There's a lot of research out there, but it is, as I said, it's currently you're throwing things at a black box, trying to draw heuristics out about why it did things you don't actually know, and some of those things that you think you've got a heuristic about, you'll give it another piece of data and it will behave completely differently. And it's not like code where you can step through in a debugger in code, right? You can't do that with a neural network, and there's no kind of representation that you can easily kind of understand and step through.
I think they're actually trying to fix that, though, right? I mean, DARPA is actually funding something called XAI, Explainable AI. Mm-hmm. I don't know how much traction it's actually getting, but they're throwing a lot of money at it, trying to actually get to something that I guess approximates like, stepping through your code, but for black box AI. I mean, who knows whether that's actually going to function, but that's what they're looking for, right? Where you can actually start to break apart your models and be able to throw one piece of information in and see what happens, and throw another piece in and throw another piece in, so that you actually can start to understand why the tip of the ear for the cat, triggers this piece of the model, and, the claw triggers this other piece, and, but we're way far away from that actually working, I think.
I mean, we've had neural networks for 60 years, and no one's cracked it yet. So
right, exactly, right.
So here's a question, right? Have we fed this legislation to a ML AI algorithm to see what comments it has and improvements to do?
We should put it through GPT-3. That would be interesting. And
then can you imagine if you see some changes that are definitely biased against an agency who and then it becomes self-conscious. I guess that's the ultimate element of self-consciousness, right? Is to impact legislation against itself, right?
Yeah, this legislation is definitely biased against AI.
That'll be great.
I definitely don't see it though, this legislation in the next, even if it becomes law, whenever it does, it's solving necessarily the problem straight away that we have with AI. And particularly when I look at like Schrems, and I'm like, we haven't been able to get international data transfers right for the past decade. We're really going to think that we can do AI, with this. Like, I think that's probably a pessimistic view, but I think when I compare it to that.
Yeah, but I think it's really good that the EU is setting the bar, and there's time there to come up with the standards. And it is a real problem that needs solving, that is having a big societal impact. One of the things that people don't die because of AI. It's about small impacts on groups of society that are kind of hidden. So, I recognizing there's a lot of work to do, I'm a big supporter of this this piece of work.
And I do think companies do actually want to do the right thing. You know, there definitely are companies I know within the recruitment space, like with ATSs, definitely do actually voluntarily do data ethics. At least try to the best that they can, which is good.
I don't know if you guys looked. I actually didn't get to it in my presentation or even in the other one that I just gave, but the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard did a study, it was last year, maybe even the year before, where they looked at like 20 or 30 different studies of essentially like AI frameworks from governmental agencies, multi-stakeholder organizations, businesses like IBM, Google, I don't think Facebook was in there, but essentially all kinds of different entities, and tried to look at sort of what were the commonalities of how do we regulate AI based upon these sort of ethical models these organizations were putting forward. And there was quite a bit of consensus about how we should actually do that. And I thought it was interesting that, you know, there's relatively broad agreement on how we should regulate AI if you just look at what all these different organizations are espousing.
What was the paper called?
It's Berkman Klein. If you just type in Berkman Klein AI, I think you'll get it. It's called Principled Artificial Intelligence.
Thank you.
Yes, well, I think, but I know this paper. I think that there may be some shared visions or shared agreement with the broad portions of AI, but when you go to the details, which was what we discussed today, it is very difficult to come to an agreement, because as for instance, as Adam, as Adam previously mentioned, well, when the data is representative, there are a lot of examples when it is impossible. I am listening a kind of echo.
Me too.
Uh,
I think it may be Dennis somehow.
okay.
Not sure how.
Yeah, well, I was saying in a nutshell, I think that there are broad agreements when it comes to the general aspects of what should be regulated, or which is the way forward. But then when you dig deeper into the details, disagreements start to emerge.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. What you can't really base policy off of it, right? But the higher level principles, most everyone agrees on.
Yeah, the problem's in the low level detail that's normative and auditable, in my opinion.
And that would be the gold mine if I could find here's how you assess it, here's how you correct it, and it's applicable to multiple different scenarios with AI. That would be literally the gold mine. Because at the end of the day, that's what businesses want. Like you say, it's just tell us what to do, and we'd love to do that. Because it's at the moment it's really hard to find how to correct the problem, even if you can see a problem in AI.
Trying to, was human in the loop? I don't think everybody agreed on that. Yeah, I don't remember.
Okay, we have any more questions? Dennis, this is normally the point where you commit us to doing a follow-up in X months.
Yes, I agree. We should be doing a follow-up on this. Absolutely. Next month?
Next month might be too soon. I think we need to see how the legislation develops a bit, but maybe later this year.
Yeah. Well, I dropped you a note. I think that that foundation, that organization you talked about, we're really good to assess it, just to understand better, right? What he does and the things he's doing. And the comment I was just gonna make, I think I was the actor because I had to be. I'm driving a little bit now, but I was gonna say that I don't think you should underestimate how much commercial appetite there is for getting clarity on this, right? I actually think that the fact that there's a regulation on the way actually almost helps a little bit to drive that focus, because it's saying, look, it's coming, but you might as well get their act together. And regardless of that, I think a lot of organizations are going to have, just like the comment just before, was, they need to understand, these things, right? Like, not only the creators need to be able to describe what they do, that the buyers need to be able to understand what they're buying. So I think there's a huge appetite and a huge interest for this, and to almost be proactive on what works and what doesn't work. Cool.
Well, maybe we can do a follow-up with For Humanity. We've got, there's probably a few people that are regular attendees at these, like Sarah Clark, who are quite active in that community.
I wanted to agree with you, Dennis, and said that there's definitely a lot of appetite within companies to know what we need to do and be proactive. Because I know a lot of companies don't want to wait till legislation comes. They want to actually be proactive and try to get some of the work done before it hits. But I want to say I'm going to drop, but thank you ever so much, Adam and Jeff and Federico, for the presentation. I found it really useful and helpful. So thank you.
Absolutely.
This was really good.
Thank you. Me too.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Take care, everybody.
Goodbye.
Can one of you guys stop? Can one of you guys stop the recording? Because I can't where I am now. I think there's a couple of co-hosts here. Adam, I think you can do it, right? There should be a Zoom option. Stop recording.
Yes, I think, because I don't have the option to stop the recording.
Okay. Well, don't worry. I'll do it in a second, you guys.
Okay.
All right,
Bye. Thank you very much, guys.
All right. See ya.